This is a production of Cornell University.
I'm Joni Mikowski, a member of the faculty, the creative writing program here at Cornell. And before we begin, I have, some reminders, some announcements. Please, your cell phones, anything that can make noise that is a device on your person, please silence it or turn it off. There is a reception after the reading. And upstairs, please come and have your books signed there. And also, this event and our series is possible thanks to the gift from Barbara and David Zalaznick. So it is an honor to introduce Joy Harjo here in our program's reading series in the English department, here at Cornell University, here in Ithaca, New York, and here on the land of the Cayuga Nation, one of the 6 tribes that in the 12th century created the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the oldest continuing participatory democracy on earth, as well as the model for the U.S. for philosophies in the United States Constitution. Joy Harjo of Muskogee heritage is the author of 10 books of poems, of the memoir Crazy Brave, its title from her name, which in the Muskogee language means so brave that she's crazy, and also of collections of interviews and essays. And she's released 4 albums of original music and currently tours with the band Aerodynamics, and previously toured with her band Poetic Justice. And she's received many awards: the Wallace Stevens Award from the Academy of American Poets, the PEN America Literary Award, the American Book Award, the Josephine Miles Poetry Award, the Williams Carlos Williams Award from the PSA, and the American Indian Distinguished Achievement in the Arts Award, as well as fellowships from the Arizona Commission on the Arts, the Sundance Film Festival, and the National Endowment for the Arts. Joy Harjo's writing is informed by a politics of witness to the injustices served by Anglos on Native American peoples, and to the ways injustice metastasizes into domestic violence, sexism, environmental degradation, all forms of abuse. And her writing nonetheless extends hope and a kind of joy. Joy Harjo witnesses reality in a spirit of healing, as one who has put down the tools of war and taken up the craft of song, a unifying, harmonizing, and generous craft that seeks truth. As Joy Harjo said in an interview, everything is a living being, even time, even words. Reading Joy Harjo is an immersion in risk and compassion. In another interview, Harjo elaborates on the complexity of witness, saying, "The micro and macro views are mirrors. We go out into the world and we encounter, but the world is also inside us, and we're inside the world. There might be a distance, and there might be intimate closeness, but it all takes place in the same space." Noting this echo of the principles of quantum physics, Harjo continued, "While each moment is layered and present, being able to discern this is another matter. Poetry is a means to discern this." In another interview, Harjo has expressed, "Poetry involves rigorous studies of the human soul. It's a discipline and provides a structure for understanding the world." Harjo, in addition to being a witness and a songmaker, is a teacher, a writer in the wisdom tradition. When I read Joy Harjo's poems, they're agile magic transporting me among scales of dimension, scales of song, scales of armor to what's bare, raw. Anglo that I am, I thought I hear echoes of Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson. Yeah, but it's not that her poetry echoes Whitman and Dickinson. These echoes don't travel in a linear way. This is poetry, a craft that interanimates matter and spirit, past and present, us and them, and I'm so glad. Please join me putting your hands together to welcome Joy Harjo.
It's really good to be back in Cornell. I think it was 25, 30 years ago when I read here. And I remember there's so much depth here. The Cayuga, I'm glad you mentioned them. You know, it's always important to acknowledge the original people anywhere you are. Well, to acknowledge everybody and say hello and, you know, acknowledge each other. And so I'm going to start with Eagle Song, or Eagle Poem, as a way of acknowledging those people who are still here and the caretakers. Ultimately, we're all caretakers, but there are actually people and families assigned to take care of certain places. And I think it's that way all over the world. But some people have forgotten, and that's, we're human beings. Eagle Poem. To pray, you open your whole self to sky, to earth, to sun, to moon, to one whole voice that is you. And know that there is more that you can't see, can't hear, can't know except in moments steadily growing. And in languages that aren't always sound, but other circles of motion. Like eagle that Sunday morning over Salt River, circled in blue sky and wind, swept our hearts clean with sacred wings. We see you, see ourselves, and know that we must take the utmost care and kindness in all things. Breathe in, knowing we are made of all this, and breathe knowing we are truly blessed because we were born and die soon within a true circle of motion. Like eagle, rounding out the morning inside us, we pray that it will be done in beauty, in beauty. So I'm happy to be here, and I've had a wonderful time visit so far. I visited MFA students this morning, and I enjoyed that, and I'll get to visit the undergraduate students, and now we're visiting. This poem is called When the World as We Knew It Ended. It's a response to 9/11. I was living in Hawaii, and I remember getting a call. The way I found out about what was going on was my Italian friend and translator, Laura Cotelli, called me up and says, turn on the television. So it's important that we remember. In a way, I think memory works forwards and backwards and inside and out, so we remember where we're going and we remember where we've been. I'm working on a historical memoir, which is going to be dealing with memory of history, because I believe it lives in all of us. And I was inspired after writing Crazy Brave, because I was thinking of my great uncle Osceola and my grandfather Managua and their alliance with Tecumseh and the Great Alliance. And then I was thinking, as I wrote about my life especially in the 70s, and being working for indigenous rights, and thinking how interesting. I think it's about 7 generations, and watching how cycles are. And then and when you're working on a poem or a book or a large project, it's really interesting how things will start coming to you because you start focusing in that direction. And I just turned in a play to the public theater. It's a musical. And I was really trying to figure out this character. The young man, we've dealt with like 3 suicides this week in our tribe, young people. And so this young Muskogee Creek kid is standing on top of one of the largest buildings in downtown Tulsa. And somebody comes to help him and he says, "Who are you? This is my own story, this is what I'm going to do." And she says, your mother's prayers called me here. Mother's prayers are very powerful. So are father's. And then it winds up as a story to deal with, his life, how he gets to that point, suicide, but music. Because ultimately, I don't want to tell you what's going to happen, but what comes into play, because it's also about the story of American music and how Southeastern Native people are part of that story, and we've always been left out of the story. We're not part of it yet. Congo Square was originally a Muskogean village, so you can kind of see what happened there. But I was working on this play, and then I had this dream, and there I was. I'll never forget it. And it's like you're awake in the dream, and you're right there, those kind of dreams, and when you come back, you know that they're important. I was holding my 7th generation granddaughter in my hands, and I knew that I really did, and I really am, and I really will be, and I really was. And there she was. And what's interesting, I looked at, she was really beautiful, and I said, "Wow, you look Japanese." I think, okay, interesting, we don't know, the story is immense, and it's been, our story has just been, it's been so condensed. It's like our immense human story in your family and all of us has been condensed into kind of a sitcom or a, kind of a very small place, but it's really immense. So, when the world as we knew it ended. And I keep thinking of all of our stories that talk about the 5th world, the 4th world, and I'm thinking, so many times we humans have destroyed worlds, and then here we are again. You can't blame anybody because it's all our story. It was coming. We had been watching since the eve of the missionaries in their long and solemn clothes to see what would happen. We saw it. From the kitchen window over the sink, as we made coffee, cooked rice and potatoes, enough for an army. We saw it all. As we changed diapers and fed the babies, we saw it through the branches of the knowledgeable tree, through the snags of stars, through the sun and storms, from our knees as we bathed and washed the floors. The conference of the birds warned us as they flew over destroyers in the harbor, parked there since the first takeover. It was by their song and talk we knew when to rise, when to look out the window to the commotion going on, the magnetic field thrown off by grief. We heard it, the racket in every corner of the world as the hunger for war rose up in those who would steal to be president, to be king or emperor, to own the trees, stones, and everything else that moved about the earth, inside the earth, and above it. We knew it was coming, tasted the winds who gathered intelligence from each leaf and flower, from every mountain, sea, and desert, from every prayer and song all over this tiny universe, floating in the skies of infinite being. And then it was over. This world we had grown to love, for its sweet grasses, for the many-colored horses and fishes, for the shimmering possibilities while dreaming. But then, there were the seeds to plant, and the babies who needed milk, and comforting, and someone picked up a guitar or ukulele from the rubble and began to sing about the light flutter, the kick beneath the skin of the earth we felt there, beneath us, a warm animal, a song being born between the legs of her, a poem. This is called Spirit Walking in the Tundra. As we're going to the north. I usually get up to Alaska once a year, sometimes twice a year, and I haven't made it up, but it's one of my favorite places. I love Barrow, Nome, and that part of the world, even though I generally don't like winter. When I'm in a place like Cornell, I'll say, whoa, it's really cold, like, it's too cold. And I get up there and I don't even think about it. And I went up to visit, to perform, but also to visit friends there. And my friend who I was staying with went to work. And her son had just gotten home from the University of Alaska in Juneau. And I never really watched somebody go, those video games. I sat there, it was a huge screen, and watched him go through. It was like watching him work through a whole story. And it kept going deeper in levels. And then I understood how it was so compelling. It was kind of it's compelling in the way storytelling is compelling. But at some point, it went on, and I saw a three-wheeler sitting outside, and I looked out and saw all this place, and I said, let's go out, let's go outside. So we went. And we started talking about spirit walking. Everybody does it. Sometimes you do it in your dreams. Sometimes you can sit there and be somewhere else. And we're always doing it. But we're talking about being conscious and doing it. And we were way up north, way up north. All the way to Nome, I traced the shadow of the plane as it walks over turquoise lakes made by late spring breakup of the Bering Sea. The plane is so heavy with cargo load it vibrates our bones like the pressure made by light cracking ice. Below, I see pockets of marrow where seabirds nest. Mothers are so protective, they dive humans. I walk from the tarmac and am met by an old friend. We drive to the launching place and see walrus hunters set out toward the sea. We swing to the summer camps where seal hangs on drying frames. She takes me home. I watch her son play video games on break from the university. This is what it feels like, says her son as we walk up Tundra toward a herd of musk ox when you spirit walk. There is a shaking, and then you are in mystery. Little purple flowers come up from the permafrost. A newborn musk ox staggers around its mother's legs. I smell the approach of someone with clean thoughts. She is wearing designs like flowers and a fur of ice. She carries a basket and digging implements. Her smell is sweet like blossoms coming up through the snow. The spirit of the tundra stands with us, and we collect sunlight together. We are refreshed by small winds. We do not need history and books to tell us who we are or where we come from, I remind him. Up here, we are near the opening in the earth's head, the place where the spirit leaves and returns. Up here, the edge between life and death is thinner than dried animal bladder. This is called Perhaps the World Ends Here. And I think the center of the world is a kitchen table, and I keep moving. I'm going to be over here. This is a moving kitchen table. And I guess the kitchen table does move to wherever there are people together and people reading poems and talking and eating and some good music. But the kitchen table is its own university, or it used to be. Every war begins there, every war ends there. The world begins at a kitchen table. No matter what, we must eat to live. The gifts of earth are brought and prepared, set on the table. So it has been since creation, and we will go on. We chase chickens or dogs away from it. Babies teethe at the corners. They scrape their knees under it. It is here that children are given instructions on what it means to be human. We make men at it. We make women. At this table, we gossip, recall enemies and the ghosts of lovers. Our dreams drink coffee with us as they put their arms around our children. They laugh with us at our poor falling down selves and as we put ourselves back together once again at the table. This table has been a house in the rain, an umbrella in the sun. Wars have begun and ended at this table. It is a place to hide in the shadow of terror, a place to celebrate the terrible victory. We have given birth on this table and have prepared our parents for burial here. At this table, we sing with joy, with sorrow. We pray of suffering and remorse. We give thanks. Perhaps the world will end at the kitchen table while we are laughing and crying, eating of the last sweet bite. I'm a member of the Muskogee Creek Nation, Ojibwa ceremonial ground, and from Oklahoma. And we have literary traditions and song traditions. And this is the contemporary rabbit story. It's called Rabbit is Up to Tricks. Rabbit is our trickster figure. And like Coyote, you remember the stories of the Roadrunner and Coyote, the Coyote figure? In trouble, walking along the edge. And yet it's often those people who walk along the edge that learn more, I think. So you'll recognize this story. It's an old story, and yet it's not at all. In a world long before this one, there was enough for everybody until somebody got out of line. We heard it was Rabbit, fooling around with clay in the wind, and everybody was tired of his tricks, and no one would play with him, and he was lonely in this world. So Rabbit thought to make a person. And when he blew into the mouth of that crude figure to see what would happen, the clay man stood up. Rabbit showed the clay man how to steal a chicken. The clay man obeyed. Then he showed him how to steal corn. The clay man obeyed. Then he showed him how to steal someone else's wife. Well, that clay man obeyed. Rabbit felt important and powerful, and clay man felt important and powerful, and once that clay man started, he could not stop. Once he took that chicken, he wanted all the chickens. Once he took that corn, he wanted all the corn, and once he took that wife, well, he wanted all the wives. He was insatiable. Then he had a taste of gold. He wanted all the gold. Soon it was land, oil, anything else he saw. The wanting infected the earth. His wanting only made him want more. We lost track of the purpose and meaning for life. We began to forget our songs, our stories. We could no longer see or hear our ancestors or talk with each other across the kitchen table. Forests were being mowed down all over the world to make more, and Rabbit had no place to play. Rabbit's trick had backfired. Rabbit tried to call the clay man back. But when that clay man wouldn't listen, Rabbit realized he'd made a clay man with no ears. This one's called Indian School Night Song Blues. So I grew up in Oklahoma, or it was Indian Territory. It was going to be an Indian state called Sequoia, but that didn't happen. And Oklahoma's difficult, I think. Maybe the whole country's difficult. North Dakota, it all seems to be coming to a head. And it's not an Indian problem. It's all of us. This is about what we're dealing with. It's about our resources, North Dakota. It's our water. I just heard another aquifer died. They're dying. What's going to happen if we don't have water to drink? And so anyway, again, it's a story that it's up to all of us. It's up to all of us to take care. We all have a part of it to take care of it. Everybody has a part to take care of. But I didn't always know that. I remember I was in high school and very confused. Some things I wasn't confused. And sometimes you can think you're confused because you see what you see and you hear what you hear, and you're young, and you don't think you see what you see or hear what you hear. But I escaped Oklahoma to Indian boarding school, which sounds kind of the opposite. I mean, because there are boarding school tradition. I mean, it's brutal, and it's child abuse to steal children out of their homes and drag them away from home. That's child abuse. And it was wholesale in this country, in Canada, and other countries all over the world. You know, because you have a different religion or a different skin color, or we want your lands, or, you know, we've decided, you know, that God gave us this land, and you're demons. But in 1967, this school was the Institute of American Indian Arts, and there was an experiment in education. We had some of the finest Indian artists teaching at that school, and yet we had the old Bureau of Indian Affairs system. And a lot of us were there. I guess that the arts came up because it was being discussed. Well, you know, most of the children that went away to this school were there because of family problems at home. And it was discovered that art was helpful, you know, or that people could express themselves in art. And so this school came about. And the school saved my life. It saved the life of a lot of young Native artists. And I went to that school during a major pivotal point in Native art, in American art. You would call it American art. I would even say world art. But we didn't know it then. We were dealing with our problems with alcohol, drugs, sadness, immense sadness. We all carry our family stories. Even if we don't know them, we carry them. But yet, being able to be among other young Native artists and say we're artists, and we were thinking about things that are behind what I do today, is that, well, how does, you know, I'm a Muskogee Creek person. I love Jimi Hendrix and John Cole. All these things figure into my art too. Yet, I'm still a Muskogee Creek artist. You don't become obliterated. Usually the purists aren't Native. You know, it's like they look at our cultures from the outside and say, well, you're like a lot of the Germans do this. They have their own Indian culture, and they've even have the nerve to say, well, we're preserving your culture because we're doing these things exactly, and you guys are polluting the culture because you're not being purists like we are. All that stuff always goes on. It goes on in jazz. You know, it goes on I think it goes on in every field. It goes on in literature, you know, and so on. But even as kids, we were there thinking, okay, and our teachers were great. You know, how do we do this? And yet at the same time, we were in a system in which, you know, if you spoke your native language, you were in trouble. One girl had to clean the sidewalk with a toothbrush. You know, there was all of these other, you know, rules into place at the same time. So you can imagine how a little skitsy it was. But this poem, kind of a poem monologue, comes out of that time. And it's not in my voice, but it is in my voice. It's a character who's there. And so this happens when all these girls in the undergraduate dorm are sitting around because they've been restrictions. Even that's a military term when you're on restriction. And usually for drinking, other things. So when you're on restriction, you have to come in right after school. You do your details. That's another military term. And my detail was working in the kitchen, and I'd have to get up at 5:30. But when you worked in the kitchen, you always got enough to eat. You always, you know, and I liked the people there. And I knew how to, my mother was a cook. My mother worked in kitchens. So it was like a home to me. And anyway, these girls on a restriction, and people felt sorry for you. And so they would bring you drugs and alcohol if you were on restriction because they felt sorry because you couldn't go out. So, And every Friday and Saturday night, the dorm matron would go around with a clipboard, and not the dorm matron, her helpers, and they would smell your breath and write down, check if you smell like alcohol or not. There were tricks around that. So the speaker of this poem is a girl who's kind of getting high, so she's telling what she really means with the girls, her friends there. I called to order the meeting of the girls on restriction at Indian school, locked up in the dorm. We broke the rules. Now it's Saturday night, no booze, you lose. Music courtesy of KOMA, straight from Oklahoma City, across the plain of tears and fears, over the mountains to hear the city different. It was in Santa Fe. Indian school, hippie crash, let's dance, where's the dorm matron, hide the stash. We all admire Marlene, she's one of the best. She's Jackson Pollock in a dress. She only leaves the painting studio for sleep or work, and on Sunday she sneaks out to the Indian hospital on the other side of campus. She took me once. The children clapped and laughed when she came in. She brought them gifts, all her desserts saved up for a week, crayons, paper, and tiny fans. We hid when the staff came in. They eventually threw her out. The hospital carried no insurance to cover the harm she might do. And Venus. Now that's a name and a history. One parent from the north on the back of a horse, and the other from the south over the back of a river. Venus is a singer, a real singer. Each singer has a particular gift. Some grow plants, some call helpers, some heal the sick, some make the dead rise up and dance. When Venus sings, we enter into a trance. We no longer hurt from freak chants. You're going to make it to Broadway, either New York or Albuquerque. Mary, Mary, quite contrary, you're as silent as a mouse in the corner of the dining hall, chewing on stale American bread. We don't know who you are, maybe you're dead to this reality. None of us are coping well with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. We've read the reports. Doesn't play well with others. Won't speak or look us in the eyes. Talks to ghosts. We hear what they're really saying. We have the guns and money, and we have your children. Mary's spirit is mostly underground with clay. When she's with us, she roams the halls in precise eyeglasses, bell bottoms laced tight, and a stack of poetry in her arms. T.S. Eliot, she says, needed to put his hands in clay. She reads him every day, perched with her books outside the powwow circle. Where's Kip? We can't find her anywhere. She's not in the laundry room practicing powwow in her underwear. She's not on the roof where she sneaks her smokes. She's not in the tent she's made of government-issued bedspreads where she sketches high fashion of Indians in Paris. Here comes Kip with a knife. There she goes. No top or bottom, only fury whirling in a spiritual nudity. She's headed out into the snow. She's what happens when somebody hurts the baby. We can corner our sheets so a quarter spins and know the drill for shots, debugging, and towels. We have a chance. So in this, my newest book, Conflict Resolution for Holy Beings, I have these little riffs, because there's a lot about music, about jazz and blues, and these little jazz riffs that run through it. So I want to read those, these little moments. I lay my body down in another city, another hotel room. Once Louis Armstrong and his band stayed here. Later, this hotel fell to trash. New money resurrected it. Under the red moon of justice, I dream with the king of jazz. Listened to an alto sax player jamming on the street. He played a few jazz standards, mostly popular tunes that people would know who changed buses there. Nice tone. I walked from the hotel into the dusk of the city to listen closer, to speak with him. We shared names, gear, info, and other stories of the saxophone road. He told me, I'm making a living out of small hopes. There's something about a lone horn player blowing ballads at the corners of our lives. Humans were created by mistake. Someone laughed and we came crawling out. That was the beginning of the story. We were hooked then. What a wild dilemma, how to make it to the stars on a highway slick with fear. Midnight is a horn player warmed up tight for the last set. 1 a.m. is a drummer who knows how to lay it sweet. 2 a.m. is a guitar player who is down on his luck. 3 a.m. is a bass player walking the floor crazy for you. 4 a.m. is a singer in silk, he will do anything for love. 5 a.m. is kept for the birds. 6 a.m. is the cleaning crew, smoking cigarettes while they wait for the doors to open. 7 a.m. we're having breakfast together at the diner that never closes. 8 a.m. and we shut it down, though the clock keeps running all through the town. When I walk over to join you in the two-step, you'd better say yes, the old woman told Death. Death laughed. For her, Death was a fine-looking native man. He wore old-style buckskin. She took his arm. He was a good dancer. They two-stepped all the way to the end of the circle of this earth fire. I always wanted to put this sign in something, so I finally put it here. Through these doors walked some of the finest people in the world. Read the sign over that Indian bar in downtown Albuquerque. The dance floor was always packed with a sea of cowboy hats. They made a felt sky. We'd head out before last call for the fights. We drove up to the cliffs in a pack to sing all night at the 49. We were those fine people, just a little lonely for home. Time is a being, like you, like me. Managua made friends with time, shared tobacco with time, so when he got on his horse to race his beloved warrior friends, he had a little talk with time. Time said, "Get on my back and we'll fly free." No matter how fast all the others raced, Managua and his horse always arrived long before it was possible. Those were the best times. I'm going to read a little bit from Crazy Brave. But before I'm going to read a poem for a poetry ancestor, just right here. We were talking earlier about, I've been teaching a class called Poetry Ancestors, and because I realized that just as we have ancestors, our poems have ancestors. They wouldn't be there without certain ancestors. And so this class is built around that, where you set up those influences of your poetry. One of mine's John Coltrane. And there's music influences, there's art, there's all kinds of influences. So I have the students set up these lists, fiction and everything. And then we start working through them in different ways. And so it's been really exciting, actually, what's happening in that class. And I talk about, well, there's horizontal ancestors, and those are people who are working, around the same time. That there's images, there's, Native American Renaissance, there's all kinds of, moments and schools, but at the same time, and so people influence each other this way. And then there's movement vertically. So, for instance, if you were going to look at music and jazz and everything goes back to Louis Armstrong. Billie Holiday, you're going to wind up at Louis Armstrong. And then if you keep going, you're going to wind up at that village there. That's where you're going to wind up there, and so on. So I wanted to acknowledge one of my poetry ancestors, Adrienne Rich. Her new collection of all of her poetry has just come out. I think, was it Norton that brought it? Because Norton was her publisher, just brought it out. And so I wrote this poem, and it's supposed to be in the New Yorker. I've never had a poem in the New Yorker. I finally sent some in. And it's interesting. They have a rule there, I found out, where you can't dedicate a poem to anyone, but if you take the dedication off, the poem does not work at all. I mean, it does work, but you wouldn't know who it was about. And so then I was working with them thinking, okay, what do we do with this? And finally they said, let's leave it in. It's called By the Way for Adrienne Rich. And this is in honor of her and Emily Dickinson, who's another poetry ancestor, and Walt Whitman. And as I was talking to my students, I sent them a question today. I'm supposed to be teaching right now. I sent them a question and said, okay, if all of your American poetry ancestors wind up at Walt Whitman, and I said, I'm not saying that they do, but if they do, who's the mother of American poetry? If he's the father, you know, and does it go to him or is it somewhere else? So it's something we're thinking about. By the way, for Adrienne Rich, and I wrote this in a hotel room as I was thinking. I had just read this New Republic article on her life, and I remembered being around her and listening to her. And I always kind of stood, actually, you know, and she was such a person for talking about silence. And yet, when I was young and around her and others, my silence defined me. I was quietly at the edge of so many groundmaking historical and literary moments and people, but I never said it. I was always, you know, I never said anything. I would be present, but I hadn't really allowed my voice yet, or I hadn't allowed myself to be part of the conversation. And so after I read this article, I kept thinking of all the things that, Adrienne, you know, I wish you were here now because I understand this now, and you know, so this was a way of talking and acknowledging her. I think it's important to acknowledge those people who have, you know, even if they're in spirit, because they can still hear you. By the way, I've given it time as if time were mine to give. There was a dam, larger than the Hoover or the President or the patent for the metal creature that sucks up all the dust. Words had to stop and ask permission before crossing over. Oh, sometimes they were wild with the urgency of Swede and leaped, but mostly the rest were kept in the net of swallowed or forbidden language. I want to go back and rewrite all the letters. I lied frequently. No, I was not okay. And neither was James Baldwin, though his essays were perfect spinning platters of comprehension of the fight to assert humanness in a black and white world. That's how blues emerged, by the way. Our spirits needed a way to dance through the heavy mess, the music, a sack, carrying the bones of those who were left alongside the trail of tears when we were forced to leave everything we knew, by the way. I constructed an individual life in the so-called civilized world. We all did, far from the trees and plants who had borne us and fed us. All I wanted was the music, I would tell you now. Within it, what we cannot carry. I talk about then from a hotel just miles from your home in the east, before you fled on your personal path of tears to the west, that worn-out American dream dogging your steps. You lived on a pedestal for me then, the driven diver who climbed back up from the abyss, Venus on a seashell with a dagger in her hands. I had to look and followed your tracks in the poems cut by suffering. Aren't they all? We're in the apocalyptic age of addiction and forgetting. It's worse now. But that dam, I had to tell you, I broke it open stone by stone. It took a saxophone flowers and your words had something to do with it. I can't say exactly how. The trajectory wasn't clean, even though it was sure. Does that make sense? Maybe it does only in the precincts of dreams and poetry, not in a country lit for 24 hours a day to keep dreams stuck turning in a wheel in the houses of money. I read about transcendence, how the light came in through the window of a nearby traveler, and every cell of creation opened its mouth to drink grace. That's what I never told you. So thank you, Adrian. Let's see. So I'm going to read a few pieces from Crazy Brave. Am I okay? Yeah. And then I'm going to, I'll read a few pieces from here. This book took me, I was 14 years behind contract on this book. No, it's not my usual MO. I wouldn't be standing here, you know. I'm usually I'll get something in, I might call and say, can I have another day? You know, maybe a week, but I will get this in. Well, that's not what happened here. And part of it, I wrote 3 different books. I started out thinking the original title was A Love Supreme, A Love Supreme, A Love Supreme, John Coltrane. And it was going to be riffs off of music. And then that went so far, and then it was like, it wasn't working. And I thought, okay, I'm going to write it like short stories. So the first short story I did was The Flying Man, and that worked out really nice. I even had an agent call me because they liked that short story and wanted to see if I had other fiction, even though it was all true. And my version, you know, as you know about memoirs, my version of the truth, or my version of memory, and sometimes, you know, memory shifts. But, and that went along, and then I started fictionalizing because your real life doesn't fit neatly into short stories, and I was having a good time, but then I realized, no, that's not working. And then I realized, you know, and then I was kind of stuck. And then I saw my editor at a conference. She says, we're calling the book in, meaning you have to turn it in now. And I realized why I was blocked. So I sat down and said, okay, I give up. And only when I gave up and wrote what I didn't want to write, I wanted to start at the end of the book, and I will read you that where I wanted to start. Instead, and then I wrote the book. But I realized all that time I had been fighting the story. And I also thought I was only 7 years behind. I hadn't done anything. I fulfilled other Norton contracts during that time. I put out 2 or 3 albums of music. But it was only when I gave up and wrote what I didn't want to write, what I was afraid of writing. So this little one page I'm going to read here is, at one point in the story, I'm a pregnant teenage mother living on nothing in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, the Cherokee capital where my then husband took me, or where I wound up. And I used to walk I felt I was invisible. I've never felt so invisible. I was utterly invisible. I made, you know, I had nothing. And I'd walk around town and look at what I couldn't buy, you know, walk by the bakery, walk by this and that. And when I lived in Tahlequah, I used to walk through town up and down hills along the creek by storefronts filled with items I had no money to buy. I walked when I was hugely pregnant and then after my son was born. It was my time alone. As I walked, I could hear my abandoned dreams making a racket in my soul. They urged me out the door or up in the night so they could speak to me. They wanted form, line, story, and melody, and did not understand why I had made this unnecessary detour. Think for yourself, girl. Your people didn't walk all that way just so you could lay down their dreams. I wanted more, and I didn't know how I would get it. My days were consumed with the drudgery of survival. I took care of the household, made meals of beans, fried potatoes, and cheap meat. I negotiated with a husband who was essentially a boy. He didn't know how to grow up. His father had abandoned the family, and he had no father map. There were flashes of inspiration and joy. I saw my son sitting by the screen door making dirt parachutes, his fine baby hair lit by the sun, singing with the radio. and my stepdaughter in a striped jumper with balloons in honor of her 4th birthday, climbing up swings in a park. But this wasn't enough to sustain the need for artistic expression. I believe that if you do not answer the noise and urgency of your gifts, they will turn on you or drag you down with their immense sadness at being abandoned. And then I wound up at the University of New Mexico. I went there because I had started working in St. Vincent's Hospital in Santa Fe, and I loved working in the healing arts. And so I got in. I think that's the only reason people wanted to send me to school, because I was going to be I wanted to be a doctor. If I had told them then I wanted to be a poetry, I wanted to study poetry, I wouldn't be here either, because nobody would have given me money to study poetry. So I wound up there, and I'm studying art. I went back into art. And I've started writing when I was painting. And so this is about leaving the bar one night and walking home. That night, as we walked home from the bar and I waited for him behind the motel, he seemed to take forever. It was about 2:30 in the morning, and as I stood there, the avenue grew quieter after the initial rush of traffic from the bar. The desk lamp inside the motel office made me lonely. I felt far away from everything. I carried an ache under my ribs that was like radar. It told me I was miles away from the world I intended to make for my son and myself. I saw my easel set up in the corner of the living room in our apartment next to my son's box of toys. I imagined having the money to walk up to the motel office to rent a room of my own. I knew what I would do. I would sleep until I could sleep no more. I would wake up with my dreams and listen and sketch and paint the visions I had put aside to take care of everyone else. I recalled the dream I'd had of a daughter who wanted to be born. I had been painting all night when she appeared to me. She was a baby with fat cheeks, and then she was a grown woman. She asked me to give birth to her. "This isn't a good time," I told her. I was in the middle of finals and assisting in planning for a protest of the killing of Navajo street drunks for fun by some white high school students. They had just been questioned and set free with no punishment. "Why come into this kind of world?" I asked her. Her intent made a fine, unwavering line that connected her heart to mine. I walked behind the motel to look for him. I found his shoes under a tree. Beyond them were his socks like two dark salamanders. A little farther beyond his socks was his belt, and then I followed a trail of pants, shirt, and underwear until I was standing in the courtyard of the motel. My stomach turned and twisted as I considered all the scenarios a naked, drunk Indian man might get into in a motel on the main street of the city. I heard a splash in the pool. I remember thinking, "He's Pueblo, he can't swim." I considered leaving him there to flounder. It would be his foolish fault, as well as the fault of a society built its cities over our holy places. At that moment, his disappearance would be a sudden relief. It was then I first felt our daughter moving within me. She awakened me with a flutter, a kick. As I walked to the pool, I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I never told her father about the night she showed up to announce her intention, or how I saw her spirit when she was conceived, wavering above us on a fine sheen of light. I never told my daughter how I pulled her from deep water. Maybe I'll close with this. I'll just close with this one. And it's called Equinox. And sunrise and sunset are very powerful. Watch the animals. They keep a lot of these practices in place, and everybody, they all stand out. You hear them at sunrise. The wisest people I know are usually up. Either they stay up all night, so they're there at sunrise, or you know, but it's a place of welcoming, of starting. It's a place, it's every day you get a new start, you know. It's a place of fresh start. It's a good place to stand. What do you do at an entryway of fresh start? Okay, thank you. And, you know, this is what I would like to, how I would like to conduct my life this day. Thank you so much for all of these gifts, for you, for, you know, all of this story. Even if it's difficult, help me and help my relatives and help all of us make it through these hard parts. And then sunset is like a letting go. I think there would be no more cancer if we could stand, if everybody every day stood at sunset and let go all the hurt and the pain. Things they did, we do, you know. Sometimes that's the hardest to let go when you hurt somebody else. Things other people do to you, if you were to stand there at sunset and let them go. So I was standing at sunset in some Michigan city, dusk, waiting to be picked up, thinking about letting things go, thinking about this country, thinking about being in the middle of it, thinking about yet some other horrible political mechanization that was going to certainly lead us all to doom. They seem to go on, and yet, you know, there's such beauty around, even everywhere, even in a place that's the most desolate. You know, even, I remember a friend from Iowa, Kambono Bayani, talking about a friend of his who would see beauty everywhere, and he would reach down in a city where you couldn't see, there weren't even plants growing through the cracks of sidewalks, you know, and he would pick up a handful of glass and colored glass. How beautiful. You know. I must keep from breaking into the story by force. If I do, I will find a work club in my hand, and the smoke of grief staggering toward the sun, your nation dead beside you. I keep walking away, though it has been an eternity. And from each drop of sun springs up sons and daughters and trees, a mountain of sorrows, of songs. I tell you this from the dusk of a small city in the north, not far from the birthplace of cars and industry. Geese are returning to mate, and crocuses have broken through the frozen earth. Soon they will come for me, and I will make my stand before the jury of destiny. Yes, I will answer in the glider of the new world. I have broken my addiction to war and desire. Yes, I will reply. I have buried the dead and made songs of the blood, the marrow. Thank you. Yeah.
What do you think it is about John Coltrane that makes him such a spiritual force in jazz over any other musician?
Yeah, I think he is a spiritual force over, if I think about the whole field of jazz musicians, he was hearing what nobody could hear but everybody could feel, and playing it. Yeah, I think the best artists do that. And ultimately, it's all about listening, whatever art it is. It's really about listening. And I think that the poetry spirit that came to me and said, okay, you're coming with me, felt sorry for me because I'm the worst listener. It's true. I still struggle with listening. My saxophone has taught me how to teach. It's constantly teaching me. It's like, what is wrong with you? You know, I'm still learning. I'm always learning. But it's ultimately about listening. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, I've recently read Crazy Brave, which is wonderful, and I was wondering if you'd be writing another memoir for the years that follow that kind of covered quickly at the end.
Okay, she just read Crazy Brave and wondered if I was going to write another memoir. Well, I did get a Guggenheim to write the next memoir. And so I've been researching. I've been doing a lot of research. And what I tell students about poems, you can research poems, you know. It doesn't have to be about you. It could be, you know, it's wide open. And it's about, you know, it's like I was thinking about Native rights movements and really how we get to where we are. And right now I'm thinking about, and not thinking about it, but I'm looking at it and thinking, well, I was thinking, well, I want to start with the origin story, you know, and of course memoir is about your own memory, but I'm thinking about historical memory, and there's layers of historical memory, and how to write a memoir like that with those layers. It might turn into something else, and I'm influenced right now by the Mahabharata. I'm thinking about how people tell stories. I remember testimony taken down at Wounded Knee, and how that was written. It was oratory, but how it was written like, you know, shorter lines. And I'm thinking about all of that. I'm not sure how it's going to fall out, but I'm thinking about how to set it up. I come from, well, there's people whose names are known in history, and there's people who aren't. I want to access the women, and yet I'm also descended from very strong leaders, and the first principal chief after removal is my grandfather. His uncle was Osceola. I think about, well, who was his wife? I've been researching, well, who was he married? You know, who was his wife? Who were these women, too, at the same time? Because any warrior is, any fine warrior, that's not about them. It's about everybody. And so I'm trying to think of how do I approach that. And so I'm researching and writing notes, and so I'm not sure exactly. And I'm thinking about the water in North Dakota, and I'm thinking about oil, you know, the oil, history of oil, and the history of oil in Indian country and in my family, because at one point, my grandfather on the other side, Henry Marcy Harjo, was in his, you know, and my grandmother, Katie Menahui, great-grandparents, when they were given their allotted lands or assigned their allotted lands by the U.S. government, one parcel was in Glenpool, which was the largest oil field ever. You know, and what happened? And then you look at the maneuvering of oil companies and the theft. I mean, you hear about the Osage, but it happened in a lot of places. You know, the making children, because if you couldn't speak English, then therefore you weren't. Then you were assigned a guardian who would take care of your land for you, of your oil rights, and you know, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of stories, and so it's figuring out exactly how I'm going to get there, and I won't know until I don't want to be 14 years late again in what I'm doing, but that's what I'm working on. So. But it's a lot of research. I'm doing a lot of research, just like for the play, a lot of research on blues and jazz and so on, and teens and suicide. Yeah. Okay. Uh-huh.
I do wonder about our sort of contemporary relationship to the past, and that there's, you know, with it seems harder sometimes to get in touch with the past, with all the buzz of the present. How can we be more receptive to the past, or is that something worth thinking about?
I think one way I'm doing it, or trying to, is with the students, is looking at ancestors, because as I was working on Crazy Brave, I realized I started thinking about time, and not in terms of years, but in terms of ancestors. And I thought, so if you go from great-grandparent to one great-grandparent to a great-great-grandchild, you have 7 generations, somewhat 7 generations. And that, so then you can hold it right here. You can have that in a household. It doesn't quite work exactly that way, but it also makes time, it brings time closer. So one thing I'm having an assistant for the first time. So I'm thinking about laying out all the students' poetry ancestors and putting them for them, you know, like coming into class, you know, in a few weeks, and laying it all up here and say, here they are, here's the time period. This is the time period of, you know, this is when I live in the time I realize of no cell phones or internet, and just kind of mark where these things are. Because we were talking about oral soundscapes and what you hear now and what you didn't then, and then write down these eras, and then put poets in these eras so they can see that Walt Whitman, I was kind of talking to them all these only just a few generations. It wasn't that far. And maybe your grandparents might have run into him on the street or rubbed shoulders on the street, and they were, you know. So I want to put it, that's one way of doing it, is to put it in the context of, so that it becomes something, they have a story to get there, and they can relate it. Yeah.
Can you say a little more about horizontal ancestors? I was so taken with this vertical and horizontal.
Those are like your ancestors. They're kind of not, they're sort of like brothers and sisters, more like relatives rather than necessarily ancestors. I mean, there's descendants you can go down too. So I've had them say, well, I'm going to give them at some point, probably in about, it's that after midterm slump, I'm going to get them all a book, have them work in groups of 2 and get books published this year. And then I'm going to have them work back and say, okay, who are these, after we get a little certain ways, who are these poetry ancestors? I'm really excited about this because I've only presented this in doing a summer writing workshop for a week, or I taught at Illinois for a little while, and I was doing part-time, 8 weeks. I was doing 8-week semesters. And I kind of fooled around. I didn't really teach that there, but I've only done it in these short moments. But now to have a whole semester to kind of play with it is exciting. Yeah. Okay. Great. Oh, sorry.
So I thought this would be an unfair question, because you talked about ancestors. In your September 11th poem, when the world ended, you made reference to Conference of the Birds.
Uh-huh.
And that's a really old ancestor.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
And I just wanted to know how that came to you.
Well, I thought of that, but I was thinking of the birds, and then I thought of that reference also. But I can't say right now exactly how, but there's a distinct, reference to that. So if I were to lay out that poem to my students, I would definitely reference that important word. Okay.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.